The element of the Scott Pilgrim graphic novels that everyone likes to talk about is the surreal world that it takes place in. I personally find this to be an inconsistent and tangential element to the franchise, but one that warrants a lot of discussion nonetheless. When I purchased the color version of the first novel, Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life, for this essay, I noticed a Daily Globe and Mail blurb on the back cover that stated this. Start quote, "For at its finest, Scott Pilgrim is much, much more than it appears to be. It's an ambitious meditation on what growing up means to a generation for whom comic and video games are not just cultural touchstones, but the dominant iconography." End quote. I jotted this assertion in my memory as I read over the first volume again, noting all of the diegetic and non-diegetic uses of these icons, sound effects, and visual cues. The presentation of dominant tropes from role-playing video games in the series is wildly inconsistent, and they are a mainstay of the series. Scott is capable of, say, leveling up upon gaining work and life experience. He is also rewarded with coins when he defeats his enemies. Scott and other characters comment on supernatural abilities being augmented in universe, and the series' plot structure is presented as a series of boss battles. There are some people who will argue that the reason these things occur is because the series is presented from Scott's own fanboyish point of view. The director of the film adaptation, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, Edgar Wright, flat out says in one of his DVD commentaries, one of many, that the entire story could very well be one of Scott's daydreams from Ramona's introduction to the conclusion of the movie. This assertion is absurd to me, and we only have to look at how the diegetic visuals, or the internal fictional world, free from outside interpretation, are handled to see that other characters are affected and live by the same rules as Scott does. If Scott were truly generating this world through his own imagination, surely there would be a moment where this mental construct is called into question, right? In the final volume, Scott is freed from the trappings of his own narrow-minded and selfish worldview, and yet the same diegetic video game tropes persist without any alteration whatsoever. There is no moment of clarity where he sees the world for what it truly is, so I can only assume that this fantasy game world for him is in fact his reality. What the gaming metaphors do serve quite well, however, is getting the reader to sympathize with and see the world as Scott sees it. Scott views life as a simplistic game with few consequences because it quite literally is to him. He also acknowledges that he lives in a graphic novel series, but that may just be a bad postmodernist joke for all I know. I'm betting on the side of yes. The tropes are his reality, but they are our anchoring point in the figuring out why he is the person that he is. Other characters deal with the very same game world that Scott deals with. They just choose to play a different way. So, following through with the premise that the iconography is being used to get the reader into the swing of things about Scott's character, let's take a look at the non-diegetic visual elements of the first volume. Non-diegetic elements in a story would be like the score to a movie. They are there for the audience, not for the characters. To really nail the diegetic / non-diegetic terminology, if you didn't understand it when I was talking about it earlier, here's a clip of this gag from The Simpsons that really drives the point home. Since Scott is also a musician, it would make sense that Brian Lee O'Malley would use visual representations of music, even going so far as to include an ill-fated attempt to throw guitar chord notation in for the reader's use only for one of Sex Bomb's songs. You know, outside of that one off-the-wall idea, which is never really used again, except for this one instance in Volume 2 where Stephen Stills breaks the fourth wall and teaches the reader how to make vegan casserole. The music in Scott Pilgrim is normally depicted by these waves of ink, little skulls, stars, and thick white hands coming out of bass guitars. Music clearly has a supernatural effect in this volume, as Crash and the boys can knock an entire audience unconscious with it. The percussive stars and the bass ghost hands probably aren't meant to be taken as literally as the one-ups and the experience points. But then again in Volume 3, music is used to attack people in the real life universe, so maybe I'm wrong there. Either way, it kind of serves both purposes though. Again, the whimsical world of Scott Pilgrim's continues to be just that, nonsense, and on this end, kind of poorly thought out. But if you think about it strictly in terms of metaphors that don't have to make consistent sense all the time, the non-diegetic visual cues serve their own purpose well enough, as they help the audience parse the novel as a whole. And to bring up another point, I was actually thinking the first time I read it that when Ramona first showed up, that she was going to be getting her own iconography associated with her, because she definitely seemed to have that going on. She had subspace all on her own, she had these star symbols. I thought that perhaps she was completely unaffected by this little video game world of Scott's, but I was proven wrong in other volumes, and also I was proven wrong the first time that Scott and Ramona share a kiss. Their first kiss is accentuated by this intrusive small version of Scott playing a victory riff on his bass, while text informs the reader that they should turn the page. This is a non-diegetic effect, but it's really kind of dumb and exploitative. I'm very glad that it didn't show up in any of the future volumes, not to mention their second kiss even has this studio audience off panel, apparently, looking at this little visual I have on screen now. That first kiss there is clearly about Scott's wish fulfillment, and his alone, and even the author/narrator tells him that he did a good job. I actually found this treatment of Scott Ramona's budding romance to be kind of objectifying and weird, especially from a series that ended up becoming pretty progressive by the end of it. And this objectification, granted, is beyond that strictly Scott's failing. Both the diegetic and non-diegetic visual cues and the narrative theme end up amplifying this over time. Scott's failings are addressed and rectified as the series continues, but the inclusion of the supernatural elements that help us understand why Scott is the way he is never really cease to wane or be addressed. Instead, O'Malley uses these visual elements to tell the story to the audience, independent of Scott's imaginative influence on them. As for the idea that the whole plot could be one of Scott's daydreams, I would have to dismiss that as irrelevant. Nothing about the narrative or the thematic significance of the work as a whole is added to by this possibility, and consequences would be eliminated if that were the case, regardless of how any other reader chooses to interpret them. The author's playful experimentation with these contrivances, although they didn't always hit the mark in the first volume, makes for a very entertaining read and some very unique eye candy, even if most of them could have been more carefully planned out for maximum effectiveness.